As college football forges into a new era, the 12-team playoff begins this season, and one of the most burning questions that needs to be answered is just how many losses can your team afford to take and still be in playoff contention? In the 10-year sample size we got from the 4-team college football playoff era, we got a pretty clear answer. If you took your second loss, you were eliminated from the college football playoff with no exceptions during that era. You take a look here at the list of teams that made the playoff during that era, and you see the list of teams that went undefeated and made the playoff, and then a list of teams that had one loss and made the playoff, and there's nobody in the two-loss category. No team ended up making it, although I do think it was possible, like Auburn in that 2019 season was a team that found themselves in the top four with multiple losses. They just ended up losing in that SEC title game, which ultimately held them out. So the rule that was pretty firm and held throughout all 10 seasons was that if you lost 2 games, you were eliminated from playoff contention. So if we're trying to determine a criteria for what qualifies you for the 12-team playoff or what you have to do, you have to split it between 2 camps, the group of 5 and the power conferences, because the group of 5 is going by a different set of standards than the power conferences. We saw just last season, Liberty went undefeated and they were still like 20-something. So really, you're just battling to be the highest ranked group of 5 team, which we have a good sample size from the college football playoff era of how many losses those group of 5 teams had that ended up on top of the heap. You see here, there was Cincinnati a couple times, UCF a couple times, Liberty and Western Michigan that had 0 losses and were the representative. A couple of times it was a team with 1 loss, and then twice it was teams with 2 losses in Tulane and Boise State. So in order to figure out how did those 2-loss teams end up being the group of 5 representative, we've got to break down what games they played and what their schedules look like. So if we look at those 2 teams in particular, we got Boise State from 2014, Tulane from 2022. Tulane is a special exception because they played in the American Conference, which in that season was arguably a step up from the rest of the group of 5 and just short of a power conference. They had UCF and Cincinnati and Memphis and Houston all in there as respected teams on their schedule. UCF and Cincinnati were ranked when they played them, so Tulane had a tough schedule, and they also played Kansas State. So it's understandable that Tulane took 2 losses but was still the highest ranked group of 5 team after playing a schedule like this. Now the Boise State 2014 case is a little bit more unique. They're probably the weakest resume that got in as a 2-loss team because they didn't beat their Power 5 team they played. They played Ole Miss that year and they lost to them. They did, however, play UConn and BYU. BYU kind of a fringe power conference team that probably bolstered their resume. But for Boise State, I'd say it was probably more about a little bit of parity and some brand recognizability. So these are key things to keep in mind when you're talking about what a group of 5 team needs and what it would take to get into the playoff. It takes less than 2 losses to get in unless you have a really tough schedule for a group of 5 team. That includes multiple either group of 5 teams that are ranked or multiple power conference teams that you can have on your resume. For Tulane, it was Kansas State. For Boise State, it was Ole Miss or BYU. And I think something that's important to remember for the group of 5 is it matters whether or not people are talking about you. On the flip side of things with the power conference teams, it's the Power 4 this season. And during the 4-team playoff era, if we expanded it to 12 teams, you're not talking about the 1-loss teams anymore, whether or not they'll make it. You're not even talking about the 2-loss teams. Plenty of them definitely would have qualified for a 12-team playoff in these last 10 years. You're talking about the 3- and 4-loss teams. So we take a look at this chart that shows us the 3- and 4-loss Power 5 teams that would have qualified for a 12-team playoff during the last 10 years. Here's all of the 3-loss teams, and then we look at the 4-loss teams. There's none. It's completely blank. There were no 4-loss teams that would have qualified. So the cutoff and the part where we've got to do some calculations is with these 3-loss teams. And some of you might be wondering, hey, wait a minute, weren't there some 4-loss teams that made their conference title games? Well, that was when we had divisions in those conferences. So I went back and looked and double checked, and there were 0 seasons where there were a top 2 Power 5 team that had 4 losses or more. Every time they had at most 3 losses as the second-ranked team, and in a world where none of the power conferences have divisions, it's just going to be impossible, very, very unlikely, something that didn't happen at all during the last 10 years, where a team with 4 losses or more made the conference title game, which would give them an automatic bid shot at the playoffs. So we're still looking at that 3-loss threshold. So let's take a look at the resumes of those 3-loss teams that would have qualified over the last 10 years. So laid out in front of you, we have each of the 3-loss Power 5 college football teams that would have made the 12-team playoff from 2016 to 2022, all spread across. And at the bottom, we have their strength of schedule rankings. USC was 18th, Florida State at 3rd, Auburn at 2nd, all spread out across the board. And if you notice at the strength of schedule here, none of them are outside of the top 30. You've got 2016 Colorado that was 30th in terms of their strength of schedule. So, as a general rule of thumb, for 3-loss Power 5 teams, they need to have a pretty strong schedule in order to get in there. I would say top 40 to give it a little bit of wiggle room. Maybe you're talking about a chaos season, but you can't just be a 3-loss team and be like, I'm in consideration. No, you have to actually have a decently tough schedule, which if you look at all these teams that were in a position to be in a playoff spot with 3 losses, they had pretty tough schedules, and that's the reason that they were still up in the top 12. So using everything we just talked about, I went through with every single team based on their schedules, everything for 2024, and figured out how many losses all 134 FBS teams can afford in the 2024 football season. So let's get into the list, starting with the 0-loss club, a team that's already eliminated, Kennesaw State. Now, this is a team that just is not eligible for the postseason and cannot make a playoff spot. So Kennesaw State is the only team in the 0-loss club. For the next tier, though, we have the 1-loss club, which is teams that can afford to lose one game, get one mulligan, and then outside of that, all bets are off for a college football playoff bid. This is any Group of 5 team that doesn't have a signature game against a Power 5 opponent or just a strong enough schedule to justify consideration or to be likely to be the top Group of 5 team if they finish the season at 10-2 with their given schedule. So this is the 1-loss club. It's a pretty exclusive club because most Group of 5 teams do have a scenario or a team on their schedule that could bolster their resume by the end of the year, but these teams just don't have enough juice. So this takes us to the 2-loss club. These are teams that can afford to lose 2 games and can have 2 mulligans to still be in college football playoff consideration. Here you have almost every single Group of 5 team. These are the teams that have a few games on there that could age really well as losses if they lose them, like Boise State plays Oregon and Oregon State and Washington State on that schedule. Maybe there's a couple mulligans on there. And it also includes any Power 4 team that's outside of the top 40 in strength of schedule. As we established earlier, if you're a 3-loss Power Conference team, to finish in that top 12, you have to have a really strong strength of schedule. Now, these strengths of schedules could change and adapt throughout the season, but based off of how everything looks in the preseason, teams are on here based on if they have a weaker schedule in the Power 5. So if you see your team on here, you can afford 2 losses. 3 is going to put you out of playoff consideration in all likelihood. Finally, we have the 3-loss club. These are the teams that can afford 3 losses and still be in playoff consideration. Every single one of the Power Conference teams on here is in the top 40 in terms of strength of schedule. And even if they turn in a 9-3 or a 10-3 season, they'll still be in the race for the college football playoff simply because they'll either have a shot at the conference title game or they'll have a resume good enough at 9-3 in order to get in because they're top 40 in strength of schedule. And we saw the precedent. It's technically top 30, but we threw in an extra 10 spots for some room for error here. And then if you notice, there's some Group of 5 teams on here, and the Group of 5 teams are the ones that play multiple Power Conference opponents that could age incredibly well and see them in a position where maybe they've got 2 top 5 losses on their schedule, like a team like South Florida. They've got games against Alabama and Miami. If they lose both those games, Alabama and Miami both end up top 5, and then South Florida maybe has one other weird loss but goes 10-3 and wins the American, they could 1000% be the top-ranked Group of 5 team. You're just holding these Group of 5 schools to a little bit of a different standard because you're asking them just to be the top-ranked Group of 5 team. You're not asking them to be in the top 12, which is why it might seem a little distorted, but it is true that teams like Tulane, Louisiana Monroe, South Florida, Arkansas State, those Group of 5 teams with a little bit tougher schedules could find a way and have a path to make it into the 12-team playoff with 3 losses. But if you noticed, we had one team that was not in a tier, and that is the Florida Gators, who belong in a tier of their own, the 4-loss club. It's true that during the last 10 years sample size in the 4-team playoff era, we never saw a 4-loss team that was truly that close to finishing in the top 12, but the Florida Gators have a schedule unlike anything we've ever seen. If you've seen the teams on their schedule, Florida could be in a position where they finish with like 4 to 5 top 25 victories and yet still lose 4 games. So Florida could put the voters or the committee in a really tough position if they end the season with, hypothetically, let's say, a win over ACC champion Miami, a win over ACC runner-up Florida State, a win over a top 10 Ole Miss team, and a win over a ranked UCF team, and yet they still have 4 losses to Texas, Georgia, and a couple other schools on their schedule that are also all near the top 10. The Gators could put together the most compelling case that a 4-loss team ever can and probably will be able to put to the table. So for Gators fans that are concerned about that schedule being as tough as it is, I think there's a path where a 4-loss Florida team could make the playoff, and that's why they're the only team in the 4-loss club. But that's it. That does it. That's how many losses each college football team can afford in the 2024 season and still have a shot at the 12-team playoff. Hopefully you understood the video. Hopefully it made sense. Hopefully you now have a bigger understanding of just what it's going to take for your team this year to be in playoff consideration. Let me know down in the comments what you think of the video, if you think everything on here is accurate. Maybe you disagree and you think, hey, Ole Miss can lose 3 games and still get in, something like that. Let me know down in the comments. But as usual, do all the awesome stuff, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys later this week. The season is almost upon us, so get hyped for that.